Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. My name is Mars, and today we're going to be doing the complete guide for CG Firion. And don't you worry, content for Dark Knight Leon is on the way as well. But of course, the biggest challenge with him is that finding friend units is basically impossible. So I'm doing the best I can. And I know that Firion and Leon are not the most popular units, but I am still covering them for the few of us who do happen to have him and want to use them, as well as for those who pull him down the line, because Firion is quite different from the other CG protagonists that we've had so far, so he does offer things that the others don't. Even if at first glance he doesn't look as good as the other ones, but in my opinion he definitely holds his own under the right conditions, and we're going to talk about all of that today. So, first things first, taking a look at Firion's TMR and STMR. His Trustmaster reward is the red sword from FF2, and this is an excellent weapon if you are trying to use less healing abilities, I suppose. This weapon heals the user whenever they deal damage, and it heals a lot. It's basically a full heal for any unit that attacks while wielding it. So that's really handy on two-handed damage dealers, as well as units like Demon Rain. And I've tried using it on Demon Rain before. Ultimately, it didn't mean I could slot out a healer. I was still using a healer in the party, but I could probably see some situations where it may come in handy. So that's not bad. It is also one of the best two-handed swords that we have available to us right now, especially as a TMR. It does have the elevated two-hand variance, so it does have higher damage variance than Freyavia's STMR, for example. So it is a really good option there if you need a two-handed sword. Now, his Super Trust Master reward is probably going to be used more than Firion himself because it is pretty outrageous. 60% attack and 75% avian, human, and stone killer materia. That's probably going to see a lot of use because I know that we've got trials that are human and stone that emperors, coming in a day and a half, and the demon wall is a stone demon and stuff like that. So there's going to be a lot of situations where you can bring that to bear. So that is definitely awesome. Now, regarding Firion's kit, he does have a handful of nonsense in his kit that you're probably never going to touch, like Spinning Axe and Rising Fist and Plundering Lance and Quick Arrow and Accelerated Arrow and Shield Blow. Those are all things that, we don't really need to mess with. All the rest of Firion's kit is contained beneath that, with his different killer imbues, his elemental imbues, and his chaining abilities. So, and of course his limit burst, which is his strongest damage ability. So in general, CG Firion is kind of like Esther in that the more times that you can fire off his limit burst, the higher your overall damage output is going to be. And, in case you didn't pick that up from the Tour of Destruction, that's kind of what my teams went for. If I could get his limit burst off every turn, I definitely did my best to do it. So when handling CG Firion's rotation, it can look a little bit confusing, but the rule of thumb that you want to follow is that you want to make sure that he is imbued, imperiled, buffed, and then uses his limit burst as much as possible. That will yield you the greatest amount of damage. So a lot of calculations and evaluations have him using his limit burst every 3 turns, which is a very reliable thing that you can go for. That's not very hard to do. Others have him doing it every other turn, or in my case, I tried to do it every turn if possible. Not easy, not always practical, but in essence, make sure he's got an imbue, make sure he's got an imperil, and make sure he's firing that limit burst. So if you were going to see what that looked like in a rotational form, one of the first skills that you're going to want to make sure that you use if you're not firing his limit burst is Pride of the Resistance. Now this is a really nice cooldown skill because it improves his attack by 200%, gives him 50% bird, human, and stone killer, and it gives him triple cast. So that's something you want to open up with on turn 1. If you are not ready to fire off his limit burst. This just assumes that you have to have him imbue himself and imperil himself. So, why not throw in some killers and some buffs on that cooldown and then imperil imbue with the light. That's a good way to start your first turn. Now the damage it will do is pretty much nothing, so don't worry about that too much. But what we've done is we've enabled triple cast, and since he's a CG protagonist, he gets his limit burst filled for free at the start of battle. So on turn tunes, since you have buffed and imperiled and imbued, you go ahead and want to go ahead and pop that limit burst. Which I could watch it over and over again, but I turned off the animation because I think you guys probably saw it way too many times in the Tour of Destruction, because I just let that thing rip over and over again. Now, if we weren't against the training dummy, our limit burst would be empty, so we would have to fill in the turn with something else if we were not entrusting. And you'll see he has a lot of cooldown skills, but their cooldown timers are pretty short, which means you're able to use them quite frequently. So on this second turn, it's a good idea to use Lord of Arms 2. Now this is an ability, like a latent skill awakening, and it is really, really handy. It does a lot of damage. Compared to, you know, some of his standard attacks. It does more damage. It's not, you know, meta tier damage, but it does more damage. But more importantly, it fills his limit burst gauge by 16 crystals, which is excellent. And it enables triple cast. So this is a good one to use when you are, you know, ready to go ahead and continue your triple cast rotation and get that limit burst filled up. The next thing, of course, that you want to use is Bloody Rose. This is another chaining cooldown that has the benefit of boosting his Finn's Blossom ability, which is the next chaining move that we want to activate. So you want to use that, and then you want to go ahead and use Finn's Blossom. And Finn's Blossom is kind of his bread and butter chaining move, but you only want to do it if you don't have cooldowns to use to kind of buff it up and to do more damage. But that's what you would do on turn 3, assuming, of course, you don't have your limit burst. Now these don't do the craziest damage because, again, he is a lot like Esther, where most of his damage comes from the limit bursts, so you'll find you do some damage, but not a crazy amount. But because of that cooldown that we used, we do have his limit burst available again. You know, if we weren't in the against the dummy, we would definitely have it back again because it fills, and that's when you would want to use it again for turn 4. Nice, nice, nice. Now, this turn would be the turn where we don't have any cooldowns available, and on those turns, you just want to use the triple Finn's Blossom. Now, of course, you could choose instead to like re-imbue and imperil this turn if you wanted to, but we don't have to this turn because he still has it available for another turn, so you could just triple Blossom. And that does okay damage. It's not super hyper meta tier damage, but it is good enough for when you don't have his limit burst available. Now, if you have his imbue and imperil ready to go, you could fire off his limit burst again this turn, but with the rotation that we were just following, we don't have it yet, so we got to reuse it. We got to do our cooldown again, Lord of Arms, and we got to do Bloody Rose. And Bloody Rose keeps that Finn's Blossom modifier up. So, you know, keep those cooldowns rolling as they're available. And then when you don't have cooldowns and when you don't have a limit burst, use Finn's Blossom. So that's probably the best way to handle that in general, is keep your Imperil Imbue up, keep your cooldowns on cooldown, and then use your limit burst whenever it's available. It's really quite simple in that regard, because you can see last turn we did the limit burst, and now this turn we have 2 different cooldowns available. So we can go ahead and do Pride of the Resistance, and then we can do Saber Adversity, and we can do Finn's Blossom. No problem. Just put those cooldowns back on cooldown. But of course, if you have your limit burst, you want to prioritize that above everything else. It really just does that much more damage, as I'm sure you've seen. And I have a very fun plan for the Emperor series boss battle that includes Firion. I'm sure if it works out, you're going to like it. It may not work out. We may die horribly, but I'm super excited to try it either way. So anyways, that kind of covers his rotation. Essentially, your action priority is make sure that you are imbued and imperiled, whether he does it himself or somebody else does it. Then fire off his limit burst if it's available, and if it's not, go ahead and use his cooldown skills. And if none of those are available, just use Finn's Blossom. And that's all there is to it. It's super, super simple. A little bit confusing at first when you're looking at him, but not bad at all. So with that, the next thing I'm going to take a look at are his builds. Now, Wild Rose Firion performs the best when he has access to Super Trust Master Rewards, and of course that could be said about pretty much any unit, but there are a certain few STMRs that just help him the most. So this build that we're going to go ahead and take a look at is the one that I'm personally using, and it is pretty close to your best in slot option. It's not all the way there. I would need another upgrade package. I'd probably need a better chest piece instead, but this is what you want to go for. You want to buff his limit burst as much as possible. You want as much LB damage as you can possibly get without sacrificing too much attack. With this particular build, we're at over 400% attack with 300% true double hand, and we're using CG Jake's gun, and the reason for that is because it boosts your limit burst damage by 30%. So on top of having, you know, the ability to roll super high attack percentage rolls from Item World, it also has that limit burst damage boost, so that is going to be your best item for him. Of course, you can run other weapons. You could do the Ignition Axe if you want some higher variants. You could also do Igaion Arm Plus when we get Scorn of Igaion. Those are both good options because of their elevated variants. You could also use the bow reward from, was that Glacial? I forget because I never use that bow, but that's an option too because that also has elevated variants. But of course, you can only use all of those weapons if you have his STMR, which that's kind of a drag in that regard, but you know, you can definitely make it work without that. Now, of course, we have Erdwin's Coronet, or Coronet. I don't know if that's a French word or not. I don't know things. That is a good hat for him to wear, or a helmet, whatever, because it gives him, again, a limit burst damage boost. Now in this case, this build is also using Jensen's trench coat because it gives the 50% attack for having a gun equipped. That is really handy. Upgrade a package and Warrior of the Crystal, of course, for some true double hand action. His own STMR for the extra killers and for the attack percentage and to activate his trust ability. And then in the last two slots, we have limit burst boosting abilities, Lion's Heart and Heart Overcoming Hatred. So because he has all of those killers in his kit, you don't typically need to occupy slots with killers. Instead, what you want to do is use those spare slots for limit burst boosting stuff. And with all of this, I think with this particular build, it brings Firion's limit burst modifier to like 92x or 98x, I don't remember what it is, but a 98 times modifier, which is humongous. That's pretty humongous for a single attack. And that's before killers are factored in, that's before breaks, that's before imperils and all that stuff. That's just, you know, his raw LB modifier with base times the LB modifying equip. So that's the sort of thing that you would want to go for if you have that equipment available. Now, if you don't have that gear, which I know a lot of people don't, you do want to equip him with the red sword so that you aren't missing out on his trust passive. And then you want to build for attack, true double hand, and LB damage boost. My recommendation is that if you're building Wild Rose Firion, what you want to do is go ahead and plug him into the FFBE equip builder. Go ahead and slot in the red sword in his hand slot and lock that in with your item world rolls, and then tell it to build specifically for his limit burst, because if we're being perfectly honest, his chain damage is irrelevant. You're going to be doing pretty much all of your damage through his weapon master LB. So you want to build for that ability because that's where it counts. And in this case, you can see we're using the red sword. We're also using Erdwin's Coronet. God, I don't know what it is. Anyways, we're using that. So if you're still trying to decide if that hat or that helmet is worth it for you, you can always grab the Moogle from the shop and just hang on to it and prism it later if you want to. Catastrophic Vest is recommended in the chest slot for that nice flat attack, and it is good because it gives a lot of defense, spirit, and some HPs as well. Really handy chest piece for him. Storm Kickers is another good option, and that's why this particular build, this Firion has almost 13,000 HP. That's pretty damn good. He's also got Cloud's Cloak for the extra true double hand, as well as a Buster style materia to cap out that 300%. He's also got Heart Overcoming Hatred and War Goddess Insignia for additional LB damage, and then Man Eater Plus because I built it to fight human targets. But yeah, this is why you tell the builder to build for targets, because sometimes it will have you slot a killer, other times it will have you slot in limit burst boosting damage, sometimes both. And the only way to be sure which is the best to give your LB the most damage is to just have the builder tell you. So that pretty much outlines a pretty decent, I wouldn't say budget build, because of course this has, you know, 5-star base TMRs in it, but it is something that I think a lot of players could definitely work towards if this is what they wanted. And the good thing is that most of this equipment is pretty generic in the sense that any true double hand damage dealer could benefit from this, especially stuff like Heart Overcoming Hatred or War Goddess Insignia. Those are both things that, for example, CG King Rain may end up using as part of some of his builds. So just something to keep in mind. It is not bad stuff to invest in. Now, speaking of investment, the question of course always comes, is CG Firion worth it to invest in? And in my opinion, for most players, he's probably not going to be the best pick. He is a good unit in the right hands. He does require a lot of support to get meta level output from, which I think for most people is just not what they're looking for. I don't think it's the most effective way to do things. Granted, my whole brand is not about doing things effectively. It's about just, you know, making mistakes and somehow surviving and pushing bosses to 1% and then wiping and dying. That's basically how I play the game. So maybe Firion is perfect for me. But for a lot of people, that's not going to be the case because he is a little bit cumbersome to build if you don't have his STMR. And because he is a little bit cumbersome to use in battle if you're trying to get as many limit bursts off as possible, because I'm sure if you watched the Tour of Destruction, you noticed that against Neo X Death, it only took Firion 6 turns to kill him. If I had a stronger Firion friend, it would have taken 5. Or was it 6 turns or 7? I don't remember. Anyways, of all of those turns, I think it was 6. Of all of those turns, only one of them, Firion did not use a limit burst, which is a little bit crazy. He had one single turn where he did not use a limit burst, and that turn was for him to imbue and imperil, because the Sylvie and Mira imbue imperil was not going to be sufficient. But that sort of thing is not practical for everyone because it required a fair amount of entrust, it required a fair amount of just support to make sure that the entire team didn't die. But it is something that, you know, if you feel like taking on that challenge and you like doing LB chaining, which is something that I love to do, okay? I mean, that was the whole reason that Hyo was a big deal. That was the only reason that, you know, like, I cared about him. That's why Esther was a lot of fun to use. You know, LB chaining is a lot of fun, so for me, it's kind of worth the challenge. But for the average player, I would say that Wild Rose Firion, if you get him off banner down the road, cool. He may be fun to play around with. But I think for the average player, he may not be worth pulling for, especially because both him and Dark Knight Leon are physical damage dealers. So if you pull one and then you pull the other on the step up banner, you need 2 of the same one to get a 7-star. It would be a real bummer if you used your resources and only got 1 of each because they basically fill the same role and you would be stuck with 6-star of each. But anyways, I digress. I think he's a fun unit. I think he's basically just a better version of Esther with a better looking limit burst, and he's not wearing bunny pajamas, so for me that's a huge win. So for me, I like him, but I think for most people he's going to be a pretty safe pass. But don't be afraid to try him out if you see him in your own parties, because or if you happen to pull him at a later date, because he is super fun to use and, in my opinion, a fun challenge to take on. So with that about covers it with the complete guide for CG Wild Rose Firion. Let me know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, as well as what you would like to see in the next video, and that's where I will see everybody next time.